there will be much focus directed at what the new Inspector General of Intelligence will do when he takes over the position. The incumbent will be filling the vacancy left by Dr Setlhomamaru Dintwe, whose 5-year term ended in March. And following the approval of Imitiaz Fazel by Parliament on Tuesday, the name will be sent to President Cyril Ramaphosa to consider for appointment. Parliament says that the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence shortlisted 12 candidates relevant to the role and the functions of the IGI based on the Constitution, the Act and other relevant legislation, as well as matters such as the high-level review panel report. Executive Director of the African Centre for Security and Intelligence, PRAXIS, David Africa, joins us now to talk a little bit more about this. David, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Hi, good morning.
So firstly, let's just start by talking about Imitiaz Fazel. Who is he, just for the benefit of ordinary South Africans?
Yeah, well, Mr. Fazel has extensive experience in intelligence. He worked initially, if we go back to the mid-90s, in the Ministry of Intelligence. So he was very involved, in the development of policy around the intelligence services, and he actually was very central in the establishment of the office of the IGI. He was the first chief operating officer of that office, and so he actually led the establishment of the office. The protocols, the policies, and so on. Then he also served as a Deputy Director General in the State Security Agency, in the Office of the Director General. So I think it would be, there are few people with that level of experience and insight into the community. And I think it's a welcome change, actually, to have someone of his caliber and experience assuming this office.
So that is important because we saw the previous preferred candidate of the African National Congress, as an example, in the Reverend Frank Chikane. That, of course, didn't make the two-third threshold that would be required in the National Assembly for this particular nomination to be approved by the President.
Yes, I mean, whatever the motivations of parties were, for not approving that that recommendation, quite clearly this one, which has been unanimous in its acceptance by the parties, it is a reflection on the candidate and the nominee now himself, and I think it's something that should be welcome. I mean, all the candidates, obviously, that were shortlisted and interviewed, to a greater or lesser extent, met the requirements of the position. But quite clearly, Mr. Fazel meets them I would say exceeds, if one looks at the CV, the requirements for the position of IGI.
And that being said, though, there was a clear expression from some of the political parties of what their expectations are of Mr. Fazel. They have, for example, indicated, have the DA, the EFF and the ACDP, that they do expect him to hit the ground running, especially on the Phala matter, as an example.
Well, given his experience and his very in-depth knowledge of the community into which he is now setting foot again, he's not a newcomer. It will not take him forever to become familiar with the terrain that he'll be covering. One would expect that he would be able to do that exactly, to hit the ground running. Again, also to reestablish the credibility of that office, and I suppose that issues relating to Phala and the involvement of the intelligence services or members within the community would be one of the issues that he would be expected to address.
But there is, of course, some skepticism around the fact that the president, of course, still has to approve this. And the timing of it is what people are already starting to question. How long will the president take before he actually makes this appointment official?
Yes. Well, if one looks at the, let's say, the unanimity with which the National Assembly has approved the nomination, and the fact that the position is actually vacant at the moment. Obviously, the position needs to be filled, as a matter of urgency, and the president surely would be alert to that fact. Both the fact of the overwhelming support for the nominee on the one hand, and on the other, the need to fill what has been a vacant position for some time now.
And we've seen what has happened previously, where there was a 2-year vacancy in this position before Mr. Dintwe was appointed. So obviously you don't want a repeat of that sort of vacuum in this position. But the president, being alive to what has happened in Parliament and the unanimity of this particular endorsement, is also obviously, some would say, somewhat conflicted in that if the parties expect Mr. Fazel to hit the ground running, looking into a matter that pertains to him, the president, he might, not be, as nimble as they would like in terms of making sure the appointment happened sooner rather than later.
Well, I think we'll have to see what happens. There's an expectation, obviously, that the president will act with the necessary urgency since the position is vacant. It's pointless for us at this point to speculate whether it'll take a day, a week, a month, a year. The president, obviously, it's incumbent on him to make the appointment. He has the authority, the power to do so. He's the only one who can. And I think there is an expectation that it will be done sooner rather than later.
So what would you say would be a fair time for the president to apply his mind, or whatever else it is that he will be doing in finalizing this appointment? What would you say would be a fair time frame?
No, I think it would be unfair to, the president is not dealing with one matter at any given moment. So obviously, he'll have to seek counsel. The president has a national security advisor. He has ministers and so on to advise him. There is a minister in the presidency responsible for the intelligence services. And, the president will take the time that he needs. And our assumption is that he will take the time that he needs and no more time than that in order to make a decision, and then either make the appointment or not.
So Phala is, of course, what is top of mind for the opposition parties in Parliament, and perhaps for some South Africans, generally speaking. But what would you say would be some of the other pressing issues that Mr. Fazel should be concerning himself with?
Yeah, I think the one very important thing is that whilst we understand that there is an oversight role by the IGI, that, the relationship between the IGI and the services, so we're talking about the SSA and obviously the police, crime intelligence and defense intelligence, the relationship of trust needs to be reestablished. This is very important because you can't, neither the office of the IGI nor the services themselves can function optimally if that relationship of trust doesn't exist. Now, quite clearly, if one looks just at what's been covered in the media, that relationship has not existed for some time. I mean, there's been many conflicts between leaders of various services and agencies and the IGI in the past. And that conflict to an extent is natural because it's, people are being watched over and this is necessary. But I do think that the nominee's experience at a very high level, both in the office of the IGI and within the intelligence services, will place him in a good position to start rebuilding that trust. To me, that is actually central there. The other thing is that what would be important, I think, would be how he transmits to the services his perception of oversight. Now, obviously, it's defined in law, and there are policies and so on. But I think that what the services require is oversight that does not shackle them. I mean, they should be held accountable. Surely you can't just run around doing whatever you want, but you need, as an IGI, to facilitate the work of the services, not to shackle them, not to create either, sort of by commission or omission, a culture where the services fear that if they do their job, they would find themselves in trouble. And I think these are very important things. And I mean, given his experience, both in the intelligence community and also elsewhere in government at senior level, one would assume that he would have that level of sophistication and insight in order to do that.
And it's obviously not going to be easy. If you look at what has been going on, the goings-on, some would say the shenanigans within the State Security Agency, allegations of political abuse of intelligence services. You look at some of the information that was revealed during the Zondo Commission, and generally the state in which the State Security Agency found itself in. And then that particular office was moved to the presidency. That ministry essentially moved to the presidency. So let's talk about that and the sort of impact that has.
I think that, the IG will come into post at a time of, actually, it's now been a while, of a hugely unsettled intelligence community. I mean, there are many things that's unsettled the community, and that the community has done to unsettle itself. And so he obviously enters at a moment where the community is fragile on the one hand, in transition on the other. So, for example, the shift of the State Security Agency into the presidency. And that creates certain dynamics around accountability, oversight that you will have to deal with, because what is happening now is that the president is responsible for intelligence. Obviously, the president has appointed a minister in the presidency, but it's not a minister for intelligence in the presidency. And so this creates a dynamic, because the person really who has made himself accountable for the services now is the president. And it creates certain challenges, in that there's no buffer between the services and the president, really. Ordinarily, there would be a minister. Or, just after 1994, we had a deputy minister within a ministry. But here you have it now in the presidency, and there are pros and cons, obviously, but it does create new dynamics in terms of oversight for the IG, because the IG will now have to conduct oversight that will sort of reflect upon the president, since this agency is now located in the presidency. So that creates certain dynamics. As the agency is transitioning, and we don't know how that, we ordinary people, we don't know how this transition will look, obviously, but quite clearly from the recommendations of the high-level review panel, there are certain indications of what one could expect. The IG now finds himself in this position with a transitioning agency. And ordinarily, obviously, this causes dynamics, because these transitioning and because there will be newly established entities, will have to create new oversight mechanisms, new reporting accountability mechanisms. So where he would have to be quite centrally involved, one would imagine. But again, I want to come back to my previous point about shackling. as you are transitioning the agency into multiple agencies or services, it is important that these services, in the first instance, exist in order to be capable. They don't exist in order to be accountable. Obviously, they must be accountable, but that is not their purpose. Their purpose is to produce high-grade intelligence for the president and senior members of government, right? And the IG, as they are transitioning, has to now sort of make sure that they are accountable, but make clear to them that his first expectation is that they must do their work, that they must fulfill their purpose, which is to conduct high-level intelligence work, and that they can do this work whilst being accountable and whilst he's providing oversight to them.
So speaking of those dynamics, in an ideal world, should the State Security Agency be located in the presidency?
It's a difficult question to answer. Firstly, there's no ideal world, so I don't want to speculate about abstract concepts and abstract worlds. The president obviously had reasons why he decided to bring the agency into the presidency. Now, the president will be aware, he would obviously imagine that there are certain benefits to this. This is why he did it. He should also be aware, one would imagine, of the risks attendant thereto. Because, and this is where the IG is quite important, because, it is about the accountability of the president, having now taken this thing into his house. He is now responsible for what happens in his house. There is no minister that can be held accountable. I mean, let's look at what happened in July last year. Whether it's been stated directly or indirectly, quite clearly there were reflections were made upon the then Minister of State Security about, the performance of the agency and so on during that, what the president called an insurrection. The president now has no person to hold accountable for such a failure, if we call it a failure. The president is responsible. So, the president obviously perceived certain advantages, and there would be advantages. But there are risks. Now, these risks, obviously, one would imagine that the president has considered how to manage them. And that he would be putting in place certain procedures to minimize sort of the actualization of those risks. And the IG would be part of that.
David, we are unfortunately out of time, but I just want to squeeze this in very briefly. There are, of course, also expectations that the IG should implement the findings and recommendations of that high-level review panel that was commissioned and released the report to the president in 2019. That panel was headed by Sidney Mufamadi. Where should he begin with regard to the implementation of that report?
It's such a, I have my own views on the report and let's say the utility thereof, but obviously the report has been accepted by the president and so it's being implemented as we speak. The IG would obviously, a lot of the report speaks to accountability and oversight, strengthening that capability, and one would imagine that the IG would firstly, in terms of his own office, would have to strengthen that office. But also, as I said earlier, he would have to look at the relationship of trust between his office and the agency and the services, the departments that's conducting intelligence work. That is where he would start in terms of doing his part of implementing the panel's recommendations.
Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks so much for your time. Executive Director of African Centre for Studies and Intelligence, PRAXIS, David Africa, speaking to us about the approval of Imitiaz Fazel by Parliament for the appointment as Inspector General of Intelligence. With that, it's time for your latest news with Leanne.